The Bottomless Cloud by Thomas Koulopoulos and David Friend. Narrated by the authors. We consistently fail to grasp how many ideas remain to be discovered. The difficulty is the same one we have with compounding. Possibilities do not add up, they multiply. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer. Chapter 1. The Real Revolution. At the turn of the 20th century, more than 98% of all factories were powered by water wheels or reciprocating steam engines. The other 2% were just starting to experiment with a radically new form of power, electricity. These new factories were role models for the future, creating a sea change in the economics of manufacturing. They could outperform and outproduce their peers. However, electric power was dangerous, complicated, and unreliable. It required the retooling of factories and dedicated resources, staff, facilities, time, and money. In addition, companies had to build enough capacity to power their operations at peak loads, even though they typically needed far less power in the normal course of operations. As the Industrial Revolution began to scale rapidly at the end of the 19th century, the need for power increased dramatically, by some estimates tenfold from 1880 to 1910. At around the same time, the first power plants capable of delivering AC power over large distances began to emerge, as both Edison and Westinghouse built centralized electric utilities. Soon, the idea of moving electric power from an on-site function to one managed by a utility became a mandate, not only because it cut the overall cost of power consumption to less than 20% of what it had been, but also because it spurred a flurry of innovation and new business models by allowing businesses to focus on what they were best at, their products and their services. Many of the cornerstone industries of the early 1900s, such as the automotive and home appliances industries, would have been impossible to scale up without the advent of inexpensive and easily distributed power, brought on by the economies of scale in the electric utility industry. Just as electricity powered the Industrial Revolution of 100 years ago, data is powering today's most valuable companies. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Even companies that make durable goods like Tesla. They couldn't exist without an enormous quantity of data. And just as electric power generation migrated to centralized power plants, the storage of data is moving from on-premises storage to large centralized clouds run by companies with storage expertise. Today, it seems incomprehensible that a utility such as electricity, which is so simple to use, so prevalent in our lives, and so fundamental to our businesses, was once so radically disruptive. Yet, most disruptive technologies follow a similar adoption curve. As reliance on them begins to escalate, they rapidly go from a curiosity to a mad rush of incompatible approaches. For example, before utilities and the creation of the electric grid, each company had its own standards for power generation and distribution. This was the advent of what we'll call Electrification 1.0, in which the first providers of electric power attempted to bundle power generation and delivery as an aside to what their core businesses were. The result was countless standards for the dynamos, motors, wiring, voltages, amperages, and machinery. Soon, the costs incurred by trying to resolve these problems started to approach and eventually exceeded the savings of internal economies of scale. In fact, many factories began to sell power to local shopkeepers and municipalities in an attempt to shore up an eroding financial proposition. Ultimately, the reliance on electrification was so widespread, the threat of incompatibility such a stifling factor for innovation, and the risk of obsolete investment so great that broad-based standards emerged and industry segmentation occurred. By 1890, the generation of electricity had begun to coalesce around two competing standards, Thomas Edison's DC current and George Westinghouse's AC current. The battle raged until the 1920s, when AC eventually won out, but DC power persisted in pockets throughout most of the 20th century. Today, as internet giants such as Microsoft, Google, and Amazon battle for shares of the world's data using their own proprietary platforms, we are again faced with incompatible
Sample complete. Ready to continue?